Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the last session. And if you're just tuning in, welcome to Cornucopia of Rhode Island, a library community of color, annual fall mini conference. This is our second session, Mariners of Color from Bondage to Boat Steerer. Please feel free to introduce yourself in chat and be sure to say hello to one of our other founders who I know is on today, Dr. Donna Gilton. A couple of reminders, don't forget to mute yourself and enter your questions into the chat. Again, Mr. Fay will answer all the questions at the end of his presentation. Let me now introduce Mr. Fay. For over 20 years, Peter Fay has researched Rhode Island history. He has authored original articles and lectured on colonial history, slavery, race, and he uncovered never before known histories of Black Jamestown Revolutionary War veterans, early mariners, and the first Black farm, which became Cedar Cemetery. Mr. Fay has presented lectures on Black labor in the textile industry at URI, on Black whalers, lectures on the history of the slave trade. He's developed tours of the Newport colonial history and authored a booklet on the Newport slave trade to East Africa. He's the co-founder of the Newport Middle Passage Project, the Jamestown Friends of Black History, and he sits on the board of the Jamestown Historical Society. And there's much more, but I won't be able to do all of it today. He retired from Brown University after a 30-year career in software and engineering. Please join me in welcoming Peter Fay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ida. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor to talk to your organization. And I'm certainly, very well aware of Corey and, all you've been doing over the years. I've gone to a couple of your conferences before, and I especially love some of the presentations you've had and the work you've done. So let me see if I can get started here. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you're now seeing the projection. Okay, great. So let me just start. Get myself oriented here. Okay, so I'm very happy to be here and share with you what I've discovered about Rhode Island history over the 20 years that I've been working as a public historian, and sharing what I've learned with people around the state. I'm especially thrilled to share this with librarians. Almost all that you'll see today was retrieved by me directly from libraries and archives across the state and the region. In fact, what you're viewing right now is a painting from the New Bedford Free Library. They're very gracious to allow me to use that in my presentation. I'm indebted to archivists and librarians at Providence Public Library, URI, Rhode Island State Archive, Newport, North and South Kingstown, East Greenwich, Redwood Library, Newport Historical Library, Jamestown, and dozens more locations where librarians have selflessly helped me. And so thank you all for making this presentation possible. It's the work of librarians that keep us going, keep us public historians going. So as you know, history is mostly about remembering that which has been forgotten and retelling that story as a narrative. If a human being starts life as a blank slate with no history, then the stories we tell ourselves about who we are defines who we really are. It may be a complete myth, or it may be partly true narrative based on some reality, or it may be entirely true and accurate, but viewed especially from one perspective. So whoever controls the narrative of history is who controls the meaning and human culture of society. So this presents a problem in a society constructed upon private ownership of wealth and upon class and race, which our country most certainly is. So we need to ask whose memory is being remembered through this history. Well, James Baldwin told us that to his experience, he said, to be African American is to be African without any memory and American without any privilege. So that's a great conundrum and something that I'd like to talk about today, the predicament of memory and who owns memory and who owns history. And to illustrate that predicament, we're going to talk about mariners of color in Rhode Island. And at the end of this talk, we can discuss whether remembering or forgetting or re-remembering can change our view of ourselves and change society as a whole. And we'll see also, like we see in this whaleboat right here, that mariners work together in an environment that often disregarded race while they're in their ships. Or perhaps more accurately, they accepted race and experienced a multiracial solidarity as working class men. But this often changed when setting foot back on shore again. Mariners are seamen, mates, boat steerers, stewards, cooks, sailors, or anybody that was on the water in Rhode Island in the period after slavery, where we're going to be focusing after the late 1700s and into the early 1800s. This is a time of burgeoning whaling business and other growth in coastal shipping, West Indies sugar trade, and forays into the East Indies as well, Indonesia, India, China, in search of goods import to the West. So this boom in whaling and more moderate growth in other shipping provided opportunities for people of color in Rhode Island, and there's a lot to learn. So let's get started. At 6 a.m., at 6 a.m. on May 3rd, 1837, John Remington, a Black Rhode Islander, was lowered down from the deck of the 400-ton whale ship Canton into a small 20-foot whaleboat with 5 other men. They were floating far out in the Western Pacific Ocean, known as the Japan Grounds. A crewmate who also made a watercolor sketch of the event that we're viewing right now, wrote that they had seen, quote, a shoal of whale. They lowered the boats in chase, he said, and they soon were, quote, fast to several of them, launching harpoons into one of the creatures. At this point, chaos struck. Lines and irons, or harpoons, broke and letting go their hold. The bow boat collided with the whale's head and broke several planks. He writes, the waist boat received a sudden shock by one of the fish's cutwaters, that is fins, and 3 more planks broke. One boat was destroyed and another was heavily damaged. John Remington from Rhode Island was bobbing helplessly in a tiny boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 19,000 miles from home. He was being battered by a 50-ton animal, measuring 50 feet long, having 50 teeth, each of them 8 inches long. He had spent 3 years aboard the ship in hard living conditions, harpooning whales, risking possible death, disease, or shipwreck upon the dangerous shoals and drifting icebergs. He risked calamity from monsoons, food poisoning, or the most common cause of death, falling from the rigging. What in God's name possessed him to do such a thing? Why would a man leave his family, friends, livelihood, and everything he knew for a dangerous, uncertain, and poorly rewarded job from which he possibly might never return? We're going to try and answer that question tonight and a few others that just beg for an explanation. We have to answer them if we want to understand Rhode Island history, how it changed and became what it is today. We'll look at the profound legacy Rhode Island slavery left upon all the towns of Rhode Island, not only during slavery, but especially after its demise, how it shaped people's choices or lack of choices, including how young men left their homes, going to sea for years at a time, at risk of life and limb, many never returning alive. So this story is about all Rhode Island towns and towns across southern New England. They all share a common history and a path of development. Newport, particularly, which I'll talk about a bit today, had an outsized role in the maritime history, but it was dependent upon rural towns all across the state for its commerce, labor supply, and very existence. So we'll see how that dependence happened. When we examine the lives of mariners of color in Rhode Island, we find over 1,300 seamen of color registered with seamen certificates. Seamen certificates which were established by federal law after 1796. They were whalers, boat steerers, mates, and ordinary seamen in the coastal trade, West Indies trade, and in the slave trade in the late 1700s, and also in the European trade. They undertook thousands of voyages around the globe. Let's look at Newport, for example, where there were 140 seamen of color that were born in Newport. If you're not familiar with seamen certificates, this is where we get our information. They provided identification of sailors, including the name, age, date of birth, and what they looked like. Now, what they looked like was crucial because these certificates were created in order to prevent sailors from being impressed, or rather kidnapped, by the British or other nations who were trying to get sailors to work on their boats. So these certificates would identify who they were. And the descriptions usually do not describe their race, because race is changeable, actually, depending upon which country you're in, and can be interpreted in different ways that can be contradictory. So what it usually describes is their skin color, and particularly their hue, exactly how dark, how much yellow, how much black or white there is in their skin, their eyes, their height, and various physical characteristics. So these mariners of color are actually born, and these 140 are born in Newport. And if you start looking at the names of these people, which I'm displaying now, you'll see a lot of the last names will be familiar to people that are from Newport. You'll see, for example, Caesar Aborn or John Boers, Robin Carr. These are all Rhode Island names that are, the last names are familiar to many people. Gardner, Champlin, and they're also the surnames of old white colonial families as well. Yet these sailors are all people of color. So the surnames were taken or used by people of color in Rhode Island who were eventually, who had been enslaved on plantations in Rhode Island, left their masters in slave plantations or in the cities, left their owners, and eventually migrated to cities and towns, mostly in southern Rhode Island. And the certificates, as we know, helped identify them, so we can use them today to identify who these people were. Let's take a little bit closer look at some of these names, and I'm listing them here for you, just some random examples from Newport. And if you look at the last names, you'll find names that jump out at you. Champlin, which is very common in Rhode Island, particularly in South County. Easton, this is Francis Easton. He was a black sailor. Easton Beach in Newport is well known to everybody, as are the last names Gardner, the Gardner House, Malbone Castle, Sheffield, Stanton, Wheaton. All these are very common names that we're familiar with in Newport. So let's see if we can remember these seamen of color. John Boers was a black sailor, sailed out of Providence in 1831. But how did he get his name? Well, Samuel Boers of Newport was a merchant in 1768 and placed an ad in the Newport Mercury for, quote, a likely Negro man lately from the coast of Africa, unquote. The Samuel Boers house can still be seen on Spring Street. So the last name Boers is very familiar to Newporters. And black seamen often took the same names as those who had previously either been buying and selling enslaved people in Rhode Island or had purchased them. William Freebody of Newport sailed out of Providence in 1823 on a schooner. He was in the what they call the coastal trade, moving goods up and down the coast of the United States. But a century earlier, Thomas and Samuel Freebody, with the same last name, were merchants who imported, quote, directly from Africa, a parcel of likely Negro men, women, boys, and girls. And today, Newport residents still are familiar with the name Freebody because of Freebody Street and Freebody Park, which we'll see right here. Kids still use Freebody Park for recreation. John F. Malbone of Newport, a Black sailor, sailed out of Newport Harbor in 1845. Jeffrey Malbone, a Newport merchant 1 century earlier, had imported directly from Guinea a parcel of what he called Gold Coast slaves. Today, you may visit Francis Malbone House on Francis Malbone Castle, they call it, on Malbone Road. Still there. Finally, Peter Satius, or Seixas of Newport, was what they termed at that time mulatto of yellowish complexion, and he left Newport on a ship in 1829. But 40 years earlier, Moses Satius, the founder of the Bank of Rhode Island, whose house still sits on Toro Street in Newport, wrote a letter to George Washington. He said, being Jewish, he was, quote, deprived of the invaluable rights of free citizens, and he hoped that George Washington would provide, quote, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, unquote. So this was Moses Satius, who owned slaves using his same last name. He seemed to be indignant or unhappy that he was deprived of invaluable rights of free citizens, being Jewish, which he had every right to be. Yet he saw no conflict in personally enslaving others for a lifetime while he attained his own freedom. So these are some of the ironies of the family's names of Rhode Island passed down through the generations and still ever present in Newport's city today. A heritage that was passed down through family names many decades after the end of slavery. And that history continues to live with us today. So now we know the enslaved origins of many of the ancestors of these mariners, and let's now look at their lives on sea. What were they like? Seafaring encompassed all races and ages across all periods of Rhode Island history. But the very first mariners of color were not free, but enslaved. Adam Miller, buried in Newport's common burial ground, was born in 1756 during the height of Rhode Island slavery, and he died at sea at age 43. He was an enslaved sailor. His gravestone notes that his wife, Belinda, was, quote, a faithful servant of Samuel Freebody, Esquire, and esteemed as a worthy member of the Second Baptist Church in this town. So we know she was also enslaved because it says servant, that's a code name for or enslaved person. Though likely she was in a different household than her husband, Adam. But as slavery declined in Rhode Island, more and more mariners of color were freed, and they still faced tremendous challenges. So let's take a look at the free mariners of color. We began by describing one of these mariners in the chaotic situation of John Remington in the Sea of Japan. What was his experience like? Well, John Remington was born in 1803 in Jamestown, likely on what we know today as the Watson Farm, which is only about a mile from my house that I'm sitting in today. Today, this farm is a working farm, and it's run by Historic New England as a tourism spot that you can come and visit. John Remington later moved to Newport to go to sea aboard the ship Canton in 1834 for a four-year journey. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall, 31 years old when he boarded the whaling ship Canton, and he was called, quote, mulatto. That was a term that was used to specify both indigenous and African descent. The white Remington family, on the other hand, had enslaved his parents back in 1774. And they had had a total of 10 Native American, African American people at their residence, likely all or mostly enslaved at that time. By 1800, none were on their farm anymore. So in those few years, the Black Remingtons, or Native American Remingtons, had fought in the Revolutionary War to attain their freedom. Some of them had purchased freedom from their owners and others had run away. And you can see in the screenshot, the yellow numbers on the right, which were from the census of the number of slaves owned by the Remingtons in Jamestown. The far right column identified Black slaves, and the left column, the Native American slaves. So John Remington, who was African American and also likely Narragansett, descended from some of the people who, these people that were listed here, who lived on these farms, who became free. And he took Remington as a surname, obviously. A generation later, we find him sailing from New Bedford, Massachusetts on a 4-year journey. I looked up the captain's logbook held at the Mystic Seaport Museum. And I created this waypoint map from the logbook to identify all the different latitude and longitudes where the ship had traveled during 1834 to 1837. As he left heading south of the Atlantic and around Cape Horn, South Africa, he took a turn north and headed up to Ecuador, landed there to restock the ship. During the voyage, they had 14 sightings of whales, 39 strikes. They boiled down 2,672 barrels of sperm oil. Then they are sailing across the entire Pacific several times, all the way up to Japan. And you can see in the far left, his course where he was situated for quite a time capturing whales in the Sea of Japan, which is where that picture was drawn at the beginning of our story. This is where he had the disastrous attack on the whaleboat by that sperm whale. His crewmates drew pictures in the ship's logs of the sea life that they encountered. These are some of the fish that they drew that are easily recognizable by fishermen today. You can see sunfish, mahi-mahi, shark, flying fish, all kinds of fish. One of the stops they made was at the island of Rarotonga in the Cook Islands in the South Pacific, where they stopped to bring on food and water. And this is the island of Rarotonga today. That's where they stopped. They were whaling, and as they brought in new whales, they boiled the blubber down in try works, which look, this is a picture on a whaling ship. And they put the oil in barrels and bring it back home. The smoke, which you see on this whaling ship, is from boiling down the blubber on a whaling ship that was off the Cape Nevin in Russia. Often a whale is a color, and their travels will meet indigenous peoples across the Pacific. Here are Siberian Yupik people on the Chukchi Peninsula in the Bering Straits, which is north of the Bering Sea. They're wearing what they call parkas, which is the origin of our word today for a winter coat, a parka. This word originates from another Arctic people in Russia, the Nenets. So ships out of Bedford often had multicolor and multi-ethnic crews. There were all colors and all races and all nationalities and all languages. There was certainly more semblance of equality on board ships, where people of color were usually paid the same rate for the positions as whites. So this is almost unheard of in any other industry at the time, where there'd be more or less equality, regardless of race in terms of income. Not all mariners of color were whalers. In fact, most mariners of color were seamen on the brigs, schooners, and packet ships between the West Indies, the South, and Europe. Some went on longer year-long voyages to the East Indies and East Africa. John Remington was whaling in the Sea of Japan in 1835, as you see right here. John Wheaton plied the Pacific in 1823 on a whaling voyage. Abraham Armstrong carried cargo to the Hebrides in 1823. And in 1820, his brother David Armstrong was in a schooner bound to Havana to purchase sugar and molasses. Moses Babcock in 1843 was whaling in the Pacific for sperm oil. 1806, Robin Carr was landing in Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, carrying 134 Africans to slavery back in Charleston, South Carolina. So that clearly was a slaving voyage. His relative, Richard Carr, left Newport in 1823 with cargo for Bremen, Germany. 1812, Newport Hazard departed Newport on the Pegasus bound for Lisbon, Portugal. In 1807, the last year of the legal American slave trade, Robert Howland landed on the Gold Coast of Africa and brought 80 Africans into slavery at Charleston. Again, the Howlands, Robert Howland's a black sailor from Jamestown. And Jacob Hull likewise did the same on a slave ship from Susanna from 1793. Abraham Martin sailed to India. Benjamin Whedon sailed to Montevideo, Uruguay. So all these people grew up in Rhode Island. Whoops, I'm sorry. And most of them ended up in Newport, New Bedford or Providence or some other port. And so we're interested in why these people left their hometowns, often in rural areas of Rhode Island, and ended up in the cities. Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not quite so obvious they made that choice. Make a career on the sea was always available, particularly in whaling, where a lot of white sailors didn't really, were not attracted to because of the difficult job of whalers. The conditions and pay were poor, and it was a fast-growing industry with very large crews and required lots of sailors on each ship. However, shipping required small crews and were shorter in length and therefore often more attractive, particularly to white sailors who had more choices. So let's look at some of the towns where the sailors originated from. When we look at the population of Rhode Island towns and rural towns, with what we find is a very large growth in the number of people of color in these towns throughout the 1700s. And of course, this mostly relates to the use of slave labor throughout these towns. After the War of Independence, they declined drastically and kept declining right through the mid-1800s. This is North Kingstown, obviously. So North Kingstown had a great growth during the slave period and then after a decline in people of color living in North Kingstown. So these people have to be going somewhere, and where they're going is what we want to look at. Here's another town, Jamestown, which was, again, purely agricultural. And there was a huge growth of people of color in Jamestown, to the point where in the mid-1700s, Black and Native Americans made up 1/3 of the entire population. And then after the War of Independence, there's a great decline. So why did they leave town? And we know the difficulties of whaling and shipping. So why would they want to leave their home, their families, everything they knew, and embark on a voyage like this? So they're both factors that both push and pull. Pulling people away from the rural towns would be employment and need to support their families. There were jobs in whaling. And there were also jobs in the slave trade up until 1807 when it was banned. So this was a draw for people looking for survival, looking for a place to earn money. There were other factors that pulled people to the cities, people of color, a sense of independence, perhaps attainable in the cities, a supported Black community that they couldn't find in rural towns, where there was often white domination and of political, economic, and social life. Jobs were abundant in the maritime industry in the cities. And there were large communities of color and social structures of support. The African Union Society in Newport, and later the well-attended Black churches Union Colored Church, which is what we're looking at here. AME Zion Church provided acceptance, support, business opportunities in the Black community. Juxtapose this community to what existed only a generation earlier. Families separated by their owners into different households scattered about rural Rhode Island, with congregations of people of color in certain instances banned by law. Frequently, they had no church, or they perhaps had a seat in a white church in the balcony. So this is a very different environment in the cities that became the new common area for people of color to live in Rhode Island. Here we have the Congregational Church in Newport. So what would be the factors pushing people of color from the rural towns? Well, first of all, obviously, would be the lack of land. People just recently freed from enslavement had no capital, they had no inherited wealth. There was nothing but employment that goes to enrich someone else. And sometimes not even employment, as that frequently ends up that the plantations were broken up, got smaller and smaller, and mechanization relieved the need for lots of manual labor. Here's an example of one of those rural farms in Jamestown, which is the current location of the Watson Farm in Jamestown. So let's take an example of someone that's born on one of these farms and what they did. Jacob Hull, which you saw in that map, that was on one of those ships that we saw, was born enslaved on the farm of Edward Hull in 1775. Ironically, the year Americans fought for their freedom from the British rule. He, though, was never freed by his master. He left South Kingstown, making it to the Black community in Providence. And the 6'1" sailor boarded a ship, the brigantine Susanna, owned by the merchant Allen Brothers in Providence. It sailed to West Africa, purchasing 112 captives and brought them home to the Americas to sell. Perhaps his owner simply abandoned Jacob Hull without manumitting him, so they would not need to post a manumission bond, as many did have to do. But clearly there were no means of support for him in South Kingstown, so in Providence, he had a wife and a community. There's another factor that might push people out of rural towns, and this is indentured servitude, which came about frequently after slavery. Frequently, people of color ended up in indentured in rural towns. That is, they are not actually enslaved. However, there are no means of support, and the town doesn't wish to support them, so the town would hire them out to whoever, hire out people who were called, what they called likely to become a charge to the town. And this person that you see on the bottom is Abraham Martin, outlined in red on the bottom. He's living in Newport, but he had been born in Jamestown. He's a seaman on the ship Mount Hope, and he is bound for the East Indies, that is India. Abraham Martin is 40 years old, a Black seaman, 5'4" tall. So why is he on the ship? Let's look at how he ended up there. Decades earlier, he was taken up by the town council in Jamestown. The town council voted Abraham Martin, a Negro man, property of Rebecca Martin, was to be sold for 2 years for $40, payment made at the market price unto the town council of Jamestown. So because his master or mistress, in this case, was unable to or unwilling to make use of his labor, the town took over his ownership and leased him to others for a period of 2 years for $40 through indentured servitude. So he was not free, but he was nonetheless rented out to other people so he could pay for his upkeep. So this is what he was leaving in the town where he was born, ending up on a ship out of Newport. Finally, another factor that pushed people out of towns was this warning out. And this is not indenture, but it's actually telling those who are not born in the town that that the town orders them to leave. If the town believes that they are not serving someone or providing labor to some farm or whatever, the town would frequently tell them they have to leave town, and they'd warn them out of town, that is, banish them from the town. This is another example of someone who is banished from the town of Jamestown. Katie Remington, a Black woman keeping a disorderly and riotous house that is very troublesome to the neighborhood. This council decrees that the said Katie Remington be broken up, keeping house in said town, and that the town sergeant notify the said Katie Remington. So this woman was banned from keeping a house in town because the town felt that they didn't like what she was doing, or whatever her particular social behavior was in town. They didn't approve of her, so they warned her out. And this Katie Remington is likely a sister of the same John Remington we described earlier, who was a whaler in the on the whale ship Canton, out in the Japan Sea that we started the story with. So Katie Remington was warned out of Jamestown, moved to Newport, where she lived right next door to a Black church and a Black community until she died. And some of her other family members became famous. Her brother, John Remington, and her other brother, Henry O. Remington, became well known. Henry Remington became president of Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in 1854. So he had moved from Jamestown to New Bedford and took up the cause of abolition in New Bedford. And he certainly did not forget how only one generation earlier his family had been enslaved in rural Rhode Island. So both those Remingtons both went to sea, and Henry Remington also ended up working in New Bedford in the Anti-Slavery Society. And I'll skip this and try and just move us ahead here. Others also gained fame and fortune after leaving rural Rhode Island. Here's another example of two brothers that grew up in South County, the Ammon brothers, Joseph and Gideon Ammon from Charlestown. This family to me is extremely interesting, not only for the history, but also for what they represent to a group that I'm working with in Newport Middle Passage. Joseph Adam Ammons, who is listed here in this seaman certificate, had descendants that still live in this area in Rhode Island. And one of his descendants is now part of the Newport Middle Passage project. Many generations later, after Gideon Ammons passed away, his descendant, his great-grandson, is still active in Newport, working to commemorate the history, Black history in Newport and the heritage of people of color in Newport. Joseph Ammons here was described on a seaman certificate as 23 years old, 5'11", dark yellow complexion, black eyes, curly hair, and scar under his chin. The Ammon brothers were two of the subjects of Nancy Shoemaker's book, The Native American Whalemen in the World. It's a great book. If you ever get a chance, you should read it or put it in your library. She described not only James Ammon's voyages, as we'll see shortly, but also his narratives that he wrote about his adventures, disclosing quite a bit about how he saw the world. So where did these brothers come from? We can discover the parents of the Ammon brothers working for wages for a white farmer in Rhode Island in the early 18 teens. Their story is mentioned in a famous diary discovered and published about early rural Rhode Island called Nail of Tom's Diary. It's about Nail of Tom Hazard, who is from the largest slaveholding family in Rhode Island, the Hazards. But by 1816, most enslaved people in South County were freed, and he was paying the Ammon's parents, George and Jerusha Ammon, for their work. And he describes several incidents where he's paying them for doing work for around his farm. And he mentioned some of the young boys that were with the Emmons. Those boys, when they're grown, went to sea for a living. George and Gideon Ammons. They became boat steerers, third mate, second mate. All these jobs had great responsibility and higher pay than just ordinary seamen. Here you see they're paid around 1/50th of the profits of the whaling voyage, which, depending upon the number of whales harvested, could at times be quite substantial. It can be several years worth of income. So whalemen negotiate their ranks, and before shipping out, their pay was called their lay, and it varied somewhat within, depending on their rank. And I'm just going to skip through here to get to the kind of more appropriate stories that we want to relate to you. On the ship James Maury in the 1850s, Joseph Ammons was promoted to second mate. Now, second mate is actually fairly responsible. It's the third highest position in the ship, under the captain and the first mate. So Joseph Ammons was second mate in times where the captain dies or one of the other mates gets sick or whatever. He would take over command of the ship. His voyage started in the Atlantic Ocean, went to the Pacific and Indian Ocean. This is one of the voyages where he keeps a ship's log. He was writing everything that happened on the ship. They made contact with other indigenous people, him being, of course, Narragansett. They made 8 ports of call and spoke 44 vessels. He describes a brig in Bahia, Brazil, which he saw, which came in with a cargo of 600 slaves. Joseph Ammons, in his log, described himself as a Narragansett from Charlestown. He left behind 2 volumes of private journals covering 4 consecutive voyages spanning the years 1843 to 53. He had 7 known voyages from the 1830s to his final voyages as second mate on the ship James Maury. In 1846, he drew some of these pictures, or actually these are stamps that he put on his logbook. It may seem strange that the bow boat, or J. Ammons, kills so many whales. It, however, is no more strange than true. So these are his words describing how many whales he actually kills when he's out on the whaling ship. Quite proud of that. When the other boat got there, okay, he said there was one incident where the whale boat was battered to pieces by a whale, and he recorded that incident, describing his own experience, and he's the one in the boat. He says, when the other boat got there, Joseph Ammons was in the state of drowning. So he's describing his own almost drowning during one of the whaling voyages. And this gives you an idea of the size of some of these creatures that they're trying to capture and bring in. In Honolulu, he wrote in 1852 that all hands on board drying bones, and so ends the day. The men from the ship had a mob, burnt about 3 houses, broke open stores, etc. So he's describing some riots that happened in Honolulu. The next day, with fine hot weather, drying bone, etc., several ships came in, put the port under martial laws. So again, there's lots of stuff going on in these seaports, and Joseph Ammons is recording all of this as he proceeds from port to port. Here at Tongariro, Cook Islands, which a picture I showed of you earlier, in 1844, he wrote, "The people were very large and very large and muscular, long-bodied and straight, the most part of them tall men, not corpulent. The large canoe had females in it. Women were seen in each of the canoes. The canoes, the Kanakoas, which is the indigenous people, were stark naked, and from every appearance were savage." So this is again how he's viewing other indigenous people in the South Pacific. Finally, let's take a look at an example of the Ammon brothers activities in Newport. This is a newspaper story that's written in 1836 describing an event that happened in Coddington Cove in Newport. If you know where that is, that's just a little bit north of the harbor of Newport. This is a Rhode Island Republican, and the name of the article is called "A Whale, a Whale." And the author wrote a poem about this event that happened in Newport. The article describes a fin whale that came into Newport Harbor, and which it said, and described who went out after the whale, and who should it be but, quote, a tawny son of Africa named James Ammons hurled the weapon of destruction at the intended victim, who this time escaped the fate which so soon afterward overtook him. So they're describing James Ammons going out in a small boat after this whale to try and harpoon the whale in Newport Harbor. The inhabitants rushed in swarms from the town, old and young, white and black, church wardens and deacons, all unmindful of the sixth commandment and hurrying to the shore. Unerringly this time and with resistless force, Ammons plunged the engine of death deep into the vitals of the startled victim. An exulting shout arose from the boats, which was responded to from the shore in a deafening burst that made the welkin ring. So Ammons killed the whale, threw it into Newport, harvested it, and getting the resulting profits from the oil and the blubber. So James Ammons' brother, Gideon Ammons, we also met a little while ago, was described in the Rhode Island Republican newspaper. It said, 13 times during the first voyage he went out, the boat was stove in, which means the boat was broken up. His good luck in escaping injury was proverbial. He had repeatedly said that getting struck with the whale's flukes was largely due to poor management. So the next cruise he went on, he shipped out as a boat steerer, meaning that he was in charge of managing navigating the boat. In other words, this is a great promotion in rank, pay, and responsibility. From that point on, neither he nor his boat's crew met with any accident. This is the type of whaling boat that these men went out on. So that was some of the history of mariners of color. And yet this history was forgotten. Somehow these astounding acts of courage, these massive amounts of whale oil produced to light the new industrial world, the stories of these Rhode Island mariners of color were forgotten. The whaling industry collapsed, shipping by sea was greatly replaced by rail, and eventually people moved on. But what became of these men who are mostly men and their families? There was a mass migration of people of color out of the towns, and people of all color, white and black, moved out of the towns. But for people of color, above all, it was due to who owned and controlled the property, controlled the town and the society at large. Almost no people of color owned land, and if so, only enough for subsistence farming in those rural areas. The people of wealth maintained their ownership, expanded it. The white owners expanded their ownership, stayed in the rural towns, at least for the period after the War of Independence. Now today, the families who own these rural estates and plantations throughout rural Rhode Island and cities of Rhode Island named our streets, named our harbors and landmarks. They named where we play soccer, where we have our homes, where we bring our kids to go trick-or-treating. The Brenton Reefs, the Gardner and Vernon houses in Newport, the town of Hopkinton, Rhode Island, named after the governor of Rhode Island, Steve Hopkins, who also owned slaves. The Samuel Boers house on Spring Street in Newport, Freebody Street, Freebody Park in Newport, the Godfrey Malbone Castle, the Satius house on Toro Street. These were the slave traders and slave owners who ran this early society of Rhode Island. While these names and locations may no longer be great estates, they are still property, but perhaps of a different kind. They are cultural property. heritage of those who created and labored to produce the wealth, of those who were bought and sold on these properties. So they belong as much to those families and descendants as they belong to the previous owners. And the families and descendants of these people never disappeared, nor were forgotten in their own communities. They persisted and they persevered from the end of the maritime era, even to today. And we have evidence of their existence. For example, here, this is a whale tooth that was carved on the ship that Moses Babcock, a Native American farmer from South Kingstown, sailed on. And he sailed across French Polynesia. And this is one of the whales that they captured. And this is now in a museum. His crewmate memorialized the voyage by carving this image on a whale's tooth. So Moses Babcock, who lived in Jamestown and later in Newport, his voyage was memorialized by this whale tooth. Moses Babcock was the brother of the well-known Christiana Babcock Bannister, founder of the Home for the Aged Colored Women in Providence. That home is still here today in Providence. It is the Home for Aged Colored Women on Myrtle Street and is commemorated by the National Park Service. That's still the same family that was part of the mariners of Rhode Island. Moses Babcock's brother, Isaac, was a founding member of the Union Congregational Church in Newport, along with Isaac Rice, who some of you may have heard of. Both these people have signed the founding document of the Union Congregational Church in Newport. And this is a Union Congregational Church. It's still standing in Newport. So the evidence of these people still lives with us today. Finally, Gideon Ammons died in 1899, a very, very old man. This article is from the Providence Journal, and it has a drawing of Gideon Ammons. They announced, Gideon Ammons is dead. He was the last survivor of the chiefs or presidents of the council, the once powerful, once powerful tribe of the Narragansett Indians. So he was the chief sachem of the Narragansett tribe, not only a whaler, but chief sachem. Ammons was a famous character during the long period when the state was bickering with the Indians for their reservation in South County, it says. In other words, to reinterpret what they're saying here, after he left the sea and settled back in South County, he fought the state for compensation of the Narragansett lands that had been taken by the state. Quote, he was in his 89th year. He was as near a full-blooded Narragansett as there was, although even in his case, there was a considerable mixture, unquote. So again, they're talking about his mixed heritage of African and indigenous heritage. In 2018, I presented an art installation at URI Providence campus, along with some other historians. And there I posted the list of all the Black and Native American mariners from Rhode Island. There, at that installation, I met a man by the name of Clinton Gardner. Clinton right here is pointing to his great-grandfather, whose name was James Ammons, and he was the boat steerer that we just spoke of. So Clint Gardner is now part of our Newport Middle Passage project, and he's attempting to commemorate and memorialize that forgotten history of slavery, the slave trade, and Black and Native American heritage. That heritage that survived the Middle Passage, the maritime era, and continues to enrich Rhode Island today. The city has given us a Liberty Square in Newport to use as a memorial, and we've hired an architect to start building a place to remember those stories that we have up until now forgotten. So we have seen that history is remembering that which has been forgotten and retelling that as narrative. And if we can control the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, then we can redefine who we really are and redefine what our society is today. Whoever controls the narrative of history controls the meaning and the human culture and our future. So it is now time, I think, to start controlling our own future. And that's what I have to say today. And again, thank you for your attendance. And should we, I don't know if we have, if we want to do any question and answer, Ida, or how you want to handle this.
Yes, I would. I don't see any in the chat, but if you have questions, please do so. Peter, thank you so much. That was so enlightening. Just to know that the smallest state in the Union has so much rich history. It's so enlightening, and we appreciate you presenting that this afternoon. I did have one question for you. What type of projects is the Middle Passage working on now other than the one you just stated? Are there any others?
Well, you may know that this Middle Passage idea has kind of been in the works for a number of years across Rhode Island. There were 4 ports in Rhode Island that were what they call Middle Passage ports during the slave trade, and that's what they're trying to commemorate. Newport has one, and of course both Providence, Bristol, and Warren were the other ports. And there is another project in Bristol trying to do the same thing, create a memorial in Bristol with the same architect we're using, Julian Bonder, who created a memorial to the end of slavery in France, a very large national memorial that they did in France. And he's working on a project in Newport. So there's those 2 projects, Newport and Bristol. There's kind of in the background a little bit in Warren and Providence, and there may be other towns as well that do the same thing. So yeah, that's what I'm working on in Newport. And then of course, in Jamestown, we're writing a history of, myself and one other person is working on a history of Black and Native American history in Jamestown. And there's also another group, the Rhode Island Slave History Project, that's putting medallions all around Rhode Island, commemorating the stories of various enslaved people around Rhode Island. So there's a lot of these kind of somewhat related and interconnected projects that are going around Rhode Island.
It's just fabulous, and it's such a rich history. We sincerely appreciate what you explained to us this afternoon. I'm often overwhelmed knowing that I moved to the state and what all the background that it entails. Are there any other questions or comments before we end? We would like to thank everyone for attending Corey's annual conference. We so much appreciate not only in state, but there are people throughout the US that attended this afternoon. I'm very, very happy for that. We would like for you, I do have one question from one of our previous presenters for our Corey conference. Let's see, he wants to know if were there any research that reflects the Black-owned ships and crews? Were there any Black-owned ships, Peter?
That's great. That's a great question. There were certainly many Black captains in the later years. This is kind of once in the mid to late 1800s of Black captains of ships. There were a number of, in that period, in the whaling period, or late whaling period, there were some Black-owned ships. And that's been written about by another fellow who's written a whole book about all the Black sea captains through New England, or actually, I guess through the United States, mostly New England. The earliest, of course, was there was one Wampanoag sea captain prior to the revolution, who did own his own ship and was, for a short period, was actually one of the wealthiest members of the maritime community for a period. And of course, that lasted only for a few decades. But overwhelmingly, you know, as we're talking about thousands of whalemen and mariners, overwhelming majority were seamen, maybe third mate, second mate, but rarely, in terms of numbers, just rarely were able to accumulate enough wealth to actually own a ship, which is very difficult to do.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Peter, and everyone else